My name is Tracey Eaton. I'm a reporter based in Florida. The project that I'm working on is called Cuban Youth, The New Dawn. And I want to try to tell the story of change through the eyes of Cuba's millennials. It's kind of cliche, but people are always saying that Cuba has been frozen in time. And evidence of that is this old 1956 Plymouth. But this country is changing. Change that began under Raul Castro. Small openings in the economy, change that many Cubans hope will accelerate so that their lives will improve. Too many people live day to day. They spend so much time just worrying about what they're going to get for breakfast, lunch, and dinner that they don't give a whole lot of thought to political change.
I met dozens of interesting young people while doing this project. I talked to them about their hopes and dreams for the future. I wondered what kind of change, if any, they were seeing in their lives now that the U.S. and Cuba have restored diplomatic relations. Most of the people I talked to said that any benefits from improved U.S.-Cuba relations hadn't trickled down to them quite yet. Alberto Figueras told me his dreams for the future were on hold. When I first met him, he was helping to distribute what's known as El Paquete, or the packet, a collection of movies and television programs that people put on USB drives then sell door to door. The second time I met Alberto, he had stopped working with El Paquete and was doing construction and building restoration, which is what he had studied in college. He said he was happier doing that. Another young man I interviewed was Hassan Nieves. He is a journalist who works at a Cuban magazine called On Cuba. I was struck by what he told me. He said now that the U.S. and Cuba have diplomatic relations, everyone's life is going to change in Cuba. There could be a step or two backwards, but there's no turning back, he said. Mass tourism from the United States will change Cuba. Cubans will no longer see Americans as the enemy. But he said relations between the U.S. and Cuba will never be normal because of the tangled history that the two countries have. Nieves told me he wants to stay in Cuba for now, to see if it would become a place of greater openness and prosperity. I was in Cuba in August when Secretary of State John Kerry visited to inaugurate the American Embassy in Havana. Many Cubans were euphoric over the news. The U.S. and Cuba have been at odds for too long, they said. But diplomatic relations with the U.S. haven't transformed the Cuban economy. One 20-something I spoke with told me that his generation had not seen a single year of economic prosperity. He said the Cuban economy had been in crisis since the day he was born. And even today, most of the young people I interviewed said they struggle to make ends meet. Natalie Baez is an actress. When I first met her during the summer of 2015, she worked at a souvenir shop to help pay the rent. On some days at the shop, she made just $1 for an entire day's work. All she wanted to do was to make her mother proud, she told me. I saw her again in December. She had left her job selling souvenirs and was working in theater. She was still struggling but seemed happier. She was following her dreams. Another woman I interviewed, Sheila Diaz, carved out her own path as an artist. I met her in Old Havana. She and two other artists were renting space near the Bay of Havana. They were in a prime spot, a few blocks from a big arts and crafts market, and they were doing well. Diaz told me she had no intention of leaving Cuba. On another day, I interviewed a woman named Mailenes Castillo. She works as an aquatic dancer and loves her job. She and other dancers perform at hotels in Havana. She said she also liked teaching and taught synchronized swimming lessons. She said she didn't know for sure what she was going to do in the future, but might wind up as a trainer in Russia one day. I came across two overriding themes while reporting this project. One was the daily economic struggle that Cubans face. The other was the pressure or temptation to leave Cuba. Several of those I interviewed were considering leaving their country for economic reasons. Julio Oñate didn't talk about leaving Cuba when I interviewed him over the summer, but a few months later he sent me a message on Facebook telling me he was in Miami. He had been in Havana trying to make a living as a musician. Music is what's really in his heart. but he told me he was not making any headway in Cuba, so he decided to immigrate to Miami to live with his girlfriend. He took a construction job, and by November he had his own car, an SUV. He told me he still dreamed of making it as a musician, but was thrilled to be making some money and progressing in his life. Julio is part of the biggest wave of Cuban migration since the 1990s. After learning that he was in Miami, I went to Havana and interviewed Julio's mother. She said she was devastated by his departure, but supported her son. She said he felt his opportunities in Cuba had run dry, and he had no alternative but to leave. One of my goals in Cuba was to interview a wide range of people. One person I met was Yessi Castro. She is transgender, and told me that while her life has improved in recent years, she still must face discrimination and harassment. I met Castro while walking along 23rd Street in Havana at 3:30 or 4 in the morning. In the days and weeks that followed, she and two of her friends, Daniela and Naomi, told me about the challenges facing transgender Cubans. They said people sometimes bully them and throw rocks at them. Castro said she was tired of it and has thought of emigrating to Miami, where some of her friends now live. Few of the 20-somethings I interviewed talked about political change. What they cared about was the economy. But I did meet a few democracy activists who are pushing for political change. Uniel Lopez said he dreams of seeing a free Cuba, a place where all political parties and civil society organizations are recognized and allowed to operate freely. Another young democracy activist I met was Arelis Blanco. She and her mother are members of a group called Las Damas de Blanco, or Ladies in White. They march every Sunday along Fifth Avenue in Havana. They demand that the Cuban government expand basic liberties such as freedom of expression. They say the U.S. rapprochement with Cuba has done nothing to boost democracy or improve human rights on the island. I also met with supporters of the Cuban government. They played down the importance of the dissident movement, and they said that the U.S. government and U.S.-funded NGOs finance Las Damas de Blanco and other dissident groups. Cuban officials accuse the American government of interfering in Cuba's internal affairs, and they demand an end to U.S. democracy programs targeting Cuba. It's clear that the U.S. and Cuban governments have important areas of disagreement, but while talking to young people on the streets of Cuba, I never encountered any animosity or ill will. Cubans I spoke with want normal relations with the United States. They are hungry for change after decades of economic difficulty. And while some are pessimistic about the prospects of change on the island, others are betting that Cuba will become a place of greater prosperity and opportunity in the future. I look forward to seeing how Cuba evolves.